Police lights washed across my mansion windows before I even reached the front door. Linda Parker stood on my marble steps in my robe, pointing at me while two officers crossed my driveway. "That man is trespassing," she said, loud enough for the neighbors behind the hedges to hear. My gate, my cameras, my front lock, and my entire smart home system were already showing an unauthorized stay inside a house I owned free and clear. The officers looked at me like I was the problem. Then my phone vibrated. The home access log had just synced. Someone had been using guest codes for 14 straight days. Linda had called the cops on the owner. She forgot the house kept receipts. The air smelled like rain on hot pavement, expensive perfume, and the lemon cleaner I never bought. My headlights stayed on behind me, throwing long shadows across the circular drive. A white Lexus sat near the fountain. Two suitcases leaned beside my front door like they belonged there. Through the tall windows, I could see warm lights spilling across my foyer. My chandelier, my staircase. A half-empty wine glass sat on the entry table where my father's brass compass used to be. That detail landed first. Not the cops. Not Linda. The compass. It had been on that table for 9 years. Now it was gone. One officer held up a hand. "Sir, stop right there." His voice was calm, professional, careful. I stopped with my suitcase still in my hand. My flight tag from Denver swung against the handle. I had come home 3 days early from a business trip because a storm canceled the last conference session. Nobody knew I was returning tonight. At least, nobody should have. Linda tightened the belt on my robe and stepped closer to the officers. Her blonde hair was pinned up like she had just walked out of a spa. "He scared me," she said. "I was house-sitting under HOA authority." House-sitting. The word made one of the neighbors whisper behind the hedge. I heard it. The officers heard it. Linda kept going. "This property has been under community maintenance review due to abandonment concerns." That was the second lie. The first was pretending she belonged on my porch. My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 48 years old. I own the Stonegate Mansion at the end of Willowcrest Drive. I bought it with my own money, paid every tax bill, upgraded every lock, and installed a security system that logs every door, camera, code, thermostat change, and garage entry down to the second. Linda Parker was the HOA president. She loved rules when they served her. Tonight, she was wearing my robe and standing under my cameras. The younger officer glanced at her, then at me. "Do you have identification?" I set my suitcase down slowly. The wheels clicked against the stone driveway. "Yes." Linda spoke before I could reach my wallet. "He could have stolen that too." The sentence hung there. Too fast. Too rehearsed. The older officer looked at her for half a second longer than before. Small shift. Important shift. I pulled out my driver's license, then opened the property app on my phone. The screen brightened my palm. Gate entry. Front door unlocks. Interior motion. Guest access. Climate changes. Every log was there. Every timestamp. Every room. The house had been talking for 2 weeks. I just had not been listening yet. The older officer stepped closer. "What are you showing me?" I turned the phone toward him. "My home system." Linda's face changed before the officer even read the screen. Not much. Just a flicker near the eyes. The kind people make when a locked drawer opens in public. Rain started tapping against the fountain behind us. Soft at first, then steadier. My phone loaded the first access report. Guest code 7. Kitchen door. 8:14 p.m. 14 days earlier. Then another entry appeared below it. Master suite motion. 8:22 p.m. same night. Linda looked toward the front door. The wine glass on the entry table caught the light. A neighbor stopped whispering. The officer scrolled down once. Then he stopped. His eyebrows tightened. There was another name in the log. Then he asked who created the guest code. The older officer kept his eyes on the screen. Rain tapped harder against the stone fountain behind us. Water slid down the curved driveway and reflected the red and blue lights from the patrol car. Linda folded her arms. The confidence was still there, but it looked thinner now. "That information can be manipulated," she said. The officer did not answer. He kept scrolling. I could hear the faint hum of my front door sensor through the app. Another entry appeared. Then another. Guest code 7 had been used dozens of times. Day after day, night after night. The timestamps formed a pattern. Someone had not been checking on the house. Someone had been living in it. A neighbor stepped closer to the hedge. Then another. The quiet crowd was growing. Linda noticed. Her jaw tightened. "This is private HOA business," she said. Nobody moved. The younger officer finally looked toward the mansion. Warm light glowed from the upstairs windows. "How long have you been staying here?" he asked. Linda answered too quickly. "A few days." I turned the screen toward him again. The log showed 14 days. 14 mornings. 14 nights. 14 separate entries into the master suite. The officer's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of look people get when two stories stop matching. Then the front door opened. Everyone turned. A man I had never seen stepped onto my porch carrying a bowl of popcorn. He froze the second he saw the police. Rain mist drifted through the porch lights. The bowl nearly slipped from his hands. "What is going on?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Linda looked like she wanted him back inside. That alone told me plenty. The officer pointed toward the doorway. "Sir, do you live here?" The man blinked. I thought this was Linda's place. Silence followed. A long silence. Even the neighbors stopped whispering. The officer slowly lowered his notepad. Linda stepped forward. "He is a guest." The man looked confused. "You told us the owner moved overseas." Another silence. Shorter this time. Sharper. Rainwater rolled off the edge of the roof. Somewhere inside the house, music was still playing through my living room speakers. Soft jazz. A playlist I had never created. The sound drifted through the open doorway. The younger officer glanced inside. "How many guests are in the house?" he asked. Linda hesitated. Just for a second. Then a woman's voice floated from deeper inside. "Linda, where do you keep the extra towels?" The officer closed his notebook. "I think we need to take a closer look." Linda's face lost color. I opened another section of the app. The security dashboard finished loading. Camera archives. Door activity. Interior occupancy reports. Thousands of entries appeared. The mansion had recorded everything. Every arrival. Every departure. Every unlocked door. Every room used after midnight. The older officer stared at the screen. Then he pointed to a single name that appeared over and over again. It was not Linda Parker. The older officer tapped the screen once. Rain drummed steadily across the roofline now. Water flowed through the stone channels beside the driveway and disappeared into the landscaping. The name on the log belonged to a man called Victor Hale. None of the officers recognized it. Neither did I. Yet his access history stretched across nearly every day of the past 2 weeks. The officer looked up. "Who is Victor Hale?" Linda did not answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. The neighbors noticed it too. The man with the popcorn bowl shifted uncomfortably on the porch. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, another door closed. The sound echoed through the entry hall. The younger officer stepped toward the front entrance. "I think everyone inside needs to come out here." Linda forced a smile. It looked strained. "This is getting blown out of proportion." Nobody agreed. A minute later, 3 more people emerged from my house. One carried a tote bag. Another held a travel mug. The third looked like he had just finished watching television. They all stopped when they saw the police vehicles. Their expressions changed instantly. Confusion first. Then concern. Then something closer to embarrassment. The officer began asking questions. The answers came slowly. One person said Linda had invited them for a community retreat. Another said the property belonged to an HOA housing initiative. A third believed the mansion had been donated for temporary use. Every explanation sounded different. None matched the others. The officer's notebook filled quickly. I stood quietly and watched. The smell of wet grass mixed with the scent of coffee drifting from inside my kitchen. Every few seconds another detail landed. A decorative lantern near the pool had been moved. The outdoor furniture arrangement had changed. Even the front flower planters were different. People had not simply entered the property. They had reorganized it. The realization settled heavier than I expected. Then my phone vibrated again. Another section of the system had finished syncing. The garage records. I opened the report. More names appeared. More entries. Vehicle arrivals. Vehicle departures. Dates. Times. License plate captures. The mansion recorded all of it. One plate appeared more than any other. A black SUV registered to Victor Hale. The same name from the access logs. The same name the officer had just asked about. I enlarged the record and noticed something else. Victor's vehicle had entered through a special authorization profile. Not a guest profile. Not a temporary pass. An administrator profile. The older officer leaned closer. "Can someone create that level of access?" I nodded. "Only the primary account owner." The officer frowned. "And that is you?" "Yes." He looked back at the screen. Then how did someone else receive administrator authorization? That question hung in the damp night air. Linda stared at the driveway instead of the phone. A neighbor quietly pulled out her own phone and began recording. Others followed. Tiny screens glowed beneath umbrellas. The atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer a misunderstanding at a private residence. Half the neighborhood was watching. Then the younger officer emerged from inside, carrying something sealed in a clear evidence bag. It was my missing brass compass, and attached to it was a handwritten note bearing Victor Hale's name. The younger officer held the evidence bag beneath the porch light. Rain streaked across the plastic surface. My brass compass rested inside exactly where I remembered it. The metal looked dull under the flashing patrol lights. The handwritten note attached to it caught everyone's attention. The officer carefully unfolded it. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. The neighborhood had gone completely quiet. Even the people standing beneath umbrellas stopped talking. He read the note silently first. Then his eyes narrowed. That reaction alone changed the atmosphere. Linda shifted her weight. The man holding the popcorn bowl stared at the ground. Something important was sitting on that piece of paper. The older officer stepped closer. What does it say? The younger officer handed it over. The note was short, very short, yet it carried more weight than an entire speech. It mentioned the compass. It mentioned my office. And it ended with a sentence that froze the crowd. Leave this where Nathan will never find it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rain tapped steadily against the porch railing. Somewhere inside the house, the jazz playlist finally ended. Silence took its place. The older officer looked toward Linda. Do you know Victor Hale? Linda folded her arms tighter. I know many people. Not an answer. The officer noticed. So did everyone else. I opened another section of the home system. My thumb felt cold against the screen. More records finished loading. Interior camera snapshots were available from common areas. Not live footage. Just archived still images triggered by movement events. Hundreds of them. I scrolled through the dates. The first image appeared. Then another. Then another. My living room. My kitchen. My dining room. Different people. Different days. Different gatherings. The mansion looked less like a private residence and more like a social club. The neighbors were close enough now to see portions of the screen. Several exchanged surprised looks. One woman covered her mouth. Another quietly shook her head. Then I found Victor. He appeared in dozens of images. Tall, dark jacket, gray baseball cap. Always comfortable. Always relaxed. Like he belonged there. The timestamps placed him inside the house almost every day. The older officer studied the photos carefully. This man seems familiar. That comment caught Linda's attention immediately. Too quickly. The officer noticed that too. Small reactions mattered now. Every expression mattered. Then the younger officer received a radio call. He stepped away for less than a minute. When he returned, his face looked different. More serious. More focused. Dispatch found something, he said. Rain rolled off the edge of his jacket. Victor Hale has attended multiple HOA committee meetings over the past year. Several neighbors reacted at once. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Linda's eyes moved toward the street. Not toward the officers. Not toward me. Toward the street. As if she expected someone to appear. The older officer asked another question. What position did he hold? The younger officer checked his notes. None officially. That answer somehow felt worse. An unofficial figure with administrator access. Unlimited entry. 14 days inside my house. The pieces were starting to connect. Then my phone displayed a new notification. The final backup archive had finished downloading from the cloud. And the first image waiting inside changed everything. The notification sat on my screen for half a second before I opened it. Rain continued falling across the driveway. The patrol lights painted moving streaks across the wet stone. Everyone watched me now. The officers. The neighbors. Even the guests standing on my porch. I tapped the archive. The first image appeared instantly. It showed my dining room from 12 days earlier. The long walnut table was covered with folders, laptops, and printed documents. At least 8 people sat around it. Coffee cups, notepads, name tags. It looked less like a social gathering and more like a planning session. Then I zoomed in. My breath caught for a moment. Linda sat at the head of the table. Victor sat beside her. Several faces around them belonged to people from the neighborhood. Another image loaded. Then another. The same room. Different day. Different meeting. My house had become a headquarters. The older officer stepped closer. Can you enlarge that? I did. The details became clearer. Whiteboards had been brought into the room. Charts covered the walls. One image showed a projector screen displaying community development plans. A neighbor standing near the hedge suddenly spoke up. "That is from the HOA budget meeting." Several heads turned toward him. "You are sure?" asked the officer. The man nodded. Immediately, I attended virtually. A quiet wave moved through the crowd. More pieces were falling into place. Then another image appeared. This one came from the living room. The fireplace glowed in the background. Linda stood near the mantel speaking to a group of residents. Behind her hung a framed photograph of my parents. The picture had been moved from the library. Seeing it there felt wrong. Not illegal, just wrong. Personal. The younger officer continued taking notes. Did these meetings have approval from the property owner? Nobody answered. Linda looked toward the mansion again. The rain had eased into a steady mist. Water dripped from the roof gutters. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills. I opened another folder. Attendance records. The smart home system tracked guest devices connected to the network. The list was longer than I expected. More than 30 unique devices had connected over the past 2 weeks. Phones, tablets, laptops. The older officer stared at the number. 30. I nodded. At least. A woman standing near the porch steps suddenly raised her hand. Linda told us the owner donated the property for community use. Another resident nodded. Then another. Similar stories followed. Different wording. Same message. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Linda finally spoke. People misunderstood. Her voice sounded smaller than before. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody supported her either. Then my phone chimed again. Another cloud folder had completed processing. This one was labeled Administrative Changes. I opened it immediately. The screen filled with account activity. Password resets. Permission edits. Security overrides. Every action was timestamped. Every action carried a user ID. My eyes moved down the list. Then I stopped. The administrator profile assigned to Victor Hale had not been created from inside the mansion. It had been created remotely, from a device registered to the HOA office. The older officer leaned in. What date was that? I checked the entry. The answer changed everything. It happened 3 days before anyone entered the house. The date sat on the screen like a weight. Rain drifted across the driveway in a fine silver mist. The older officer read the timestamp twice. Then he looked toward Linda. The administrator profile had been created 3 days before the first recorded entry into my mansion. That detail mattered. It destroyed the idea that any of this happened by accident. The neighbors sensed it too. The quiet crowd had grown larger. Porch lights glowed up and down the street. More people stood beneath umbrellas watching events unfold. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. The younger officer copied the information into his notebook. The authorization came from the HOA office network? He asked. That is what the record shows, I replied. He nodded slowly. Linda stared at the wet pavement. Her earlier confidence had faded. Not disappeared, just faded. The older officer asked a simple question. Who had access to the office system that day? Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. The answer was apparently not as easy as before. I scrolled deeper into the account history. More records appeared. Password changes. Access requests. Approval confirmations. The system documented every step. Whoever created Victor's account had left fingerprints everywhere. Digital fingerprints. The kind people forget about. A cool breeze moved through the open front door. I could smell coffee from somewhere inside. One of the guests quietly set down a travel mug on the porch railing. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Then another resident stepped forward from the crowd. I recognized him immediately. Harold Simmons, former HOA treasurer, retired accountant. Careful man, quiet man, the kind who noticed details. I remember that week, Harold said. Several heads turned toward him. He pointed toward Linda. There was an emergency board session. Linda's eyes moved toward him instantly. Harold continued anyway. Victor attended that meeting. A murmur spread through the neighborhood. The younger officer looked interested. Was he a board member? Harold shook his head. No. Was he a consultant? Another pause. Harold frowned. Not officially. That answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. The same phrase dispatch had already used. Not officially. The pattern kept repeating. I opened another archived folder. This one contained visitor registrations from the gate system. Hundreds of entries appeared. Most belonged to delivery drivers, landscapers, and maintenance crews. Then I found Victor again. His first recorded visit happened only hours after the administrator account was created. The timing lined up perfectly. The officer studied the screen. Looks coordinated. Nobody disagreed. Even Linda remained silent. Thunder rolled softly across the hills again. The storm was moving farther away now. The neighborhood lights reflected across the wet road. Then Harold reached into his jacket pocket. I almost forgot. Everyone looked at him. He removed a folded document protected inside a plastic sleeve. Water droplets clung to the surface. I kept a copy because something felt wrong. The older officer accepted it carefully. The page appeared to be a meeting agenda. Ordinary at first glance. Then he reached the final item listed near the bottom. His expression changed immediately. The agenda mentioned a private property transition plan. And right beside that phrase was my address. The older officer read the agenda twice. Rain had almost stopped now. Only a few drops fell from the trees lining the driveway. The neighborhood stood frozen around us. Nobody expected to see my address printed on an HOA meeting document. Harold adjusted his glasses and pointed toward the page. That item was never discussed publicly, he said. At least not in any meeting I attended. The officer nodded and slipped the document into a protective folder. Linda remained silent. That silence was becoming more noticeable than anything she said. The younger officer looked toward her. Can you explain why this property appears on an internal planning agenda? Linda inhaled slowly. It was a preliminary discussion. The answer landed poorly. Several neighbors exchanged looks. A preliminary discussion about someone else's mansion was already difficult to explain. A discussion followed by administrator access, guest codes, and 2 weeks of occupancy was even harder. I opened another archive folder. The screen illuminated my hands in the damp night air. More records appeared. Meeting schedules, device connections, calendar invitations. Most of them meant little by themselves. Together, they told a story. A very clear story. One invitation caught my attention immediately. The title read Community Transition Workshop. The location listed beneath it was my home address. The date matched one of the largest gatherings shown in the archived images. The officer leaned closer. How many people attended? I counted the connected devices. At least 16. A low murmur spread through the crowd again. One woman near the mailbox shook her head. Another quietly stepped farther away from Linda. Small movements. Important movements. Trust was shifting in real time. Then Harold spoke again. There is something else. Everyone turned toward him. He reached into his jacket and removed a second folded paper. Unlike the first document, this one looked older. The edges were worn. I found this after resigning from the finance committee. The older officer accepted it carefully. The page contained meeting notes, handwritten notes, short bullet points, dates, names, questions. Nothing unusual at first. Then he reached the bottom section. His eyes narrowed immediately. The heading read Property Utilization Opportunities. My address appeared there again. So did Victor Hale's name. The younger officer looked up. Why would a private residence appear under that category? Nobody answered. Not even Linda. The wind moved through the trees behind the mansion. Wet leaves rustled softly in the darkness. The house lights reflected across puddles scattered throughout the driveway. I suddenly noticed something on the screen. A folder I had overlooked earlier. Archived communications. Thousands of files sat inside. Emails, messages, shared documents. I selected the most recent group. The system began loading. The progress bar crawled forward. 5%, 10%, 15%. Everyone waited. Even the officers stopped speaking. The crowd seemed to sense that something significant was coming. Then the first message appeared. The sender was Victor Hale. The recipient list included multiple HOA officials. One name sat at the top. Linda Parker. The subject line was short. Only 4 words. Yet those 4 words changed the mood of the entire street. The message was titled Phase 1 Complete. The words sat on the screen beneath the glow of my phone. Phase 1 complete. Rainwater dripped from the trees and landed softly on the driveway. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The older officer leaned closer. The crowd leaned closer too. It felt as if the entire neighborhood had stopped breathing at once. I opened the message. The first lines appeared immediately. Victor described successful access to the property. He described resident acceptance. He described operational use of the house. The language sounded cold, organized, deliberate. Nothing about it sounded accidental. The officer read silently beside me. His expression hardened with every line. Linda stared toward the street. She no longer looked at the screen. She no longer looked at the officers. The confidence she carried earlier had almost vanished. Then another message loaded beneath the first. Same sender. Same recipients. The subject line read next steps. A low murmur spread through the crowd. I opened it. The email referenced future planning meetings, community presentations, long-term occupancy projections. One sentence drew immediate attention. The property was described as an ideal location for transitional leadership operations. The younger officer looked confused. What exactly does that mean? Nobody answered. Even the guests standing on the porch appeared shocked. One woman quietly stepped farther away from Linda. Another crossed her arms and looked toward the mansion with disbelief. Harold moved beside me and adjusted his glasses. That terminology was never approved by any committee. The older officer nodded. He seemed to be connecting the same dots. Then another attachment appeared beneath the email chain. It was a presentation file. The timestamp showed it had been viewed repeatedly during the past 2 weeks. I opened it. Slide after slide filled the screen. Community expansion concepts. Event planning. Resource allocation. Then a property map appeared. My property map. My mansion sat highlighted in the center. Several arrows pointed toward different sections of the estate. Notes had been added beside them. Meeting space. Guest lodging. Administrative use. The crowd reacted immediately. Audible gasps. Shaking heads. Whispered conversations. The atmosphere shifted again. This was no longer about unauthorized access. It was about intent. The younger officer slowly lowered his notebook. This was being planned before anyone entered the house. Looks that way, the older officer replied. Linda finally spoke. Her voice sounded tired now. Those were only ideas. Harold shook his head. Ideas do not create administrator accounts. Another resident stepped forward from the crowd. Then another. People who had remained silent all evening began sharing stories. Invitations they received. Meetings they attended. Assumptions they were encouraged to believe. Each story fit another piece into the puzzle. The pattern became impossible to ignore. My phone vibrated again. Another archived folder had finished processing. This one carried a different label. Financial records. The older officer immediately noticed it. Open that. I tapped the folder. Rows of documents appeared. Payment records. Expense reports. Reimbursement requests. The first page loaded. Then the second. Then the third. Every document pointed toward the same period. The same names. The same activities. Then I reached a transaction highlighted in red. The amount was not large. The description mattered more. The payment authorization referenced occupancy preparation services at my address. The older officer stared at the entry. Then he looked toward Linda. I think we need to discuss this downtown. But one final document was still loading. The final document took only a few seconds to load. It felt much longer. The entire street waited in silence. Water dripped from the trees. Patrol lights reflected across the wet pavement. My phone screen brightened as the file opened. The title appeared first. Community Asset Transition Proposal. The older officer immediately leaned closer. Harold adjusted his glasses again. Even the neighbors standing near the mailbox stepped forward. I scrolled down. The proposal outlined future plans for my property, meeting schedules, usage concepts, occupancy phases, administrative responsibilities. Everything was organized into neat sections. It looked professional. It looked intentional. Then I reached the final page. That was where everything unraveled. At the bottom sat a signature block. Victor Hale's name appeared first. Beneath it sat another name. Linda Parker. Nobody said a word. The older officer slowly exhaled. Linda stared at the ground. The confidence she arrived with was completely gone now. One of the guests quietly stepped away from the porch. Then another. The distance between them and Linda kept growing. The younger officer closed his notebook. I think we have enough information for tonight. Nobody disagreed. Not even Linda. The neighbors were no longer whispering. They were simply watching the truth settle into place. Harold folded his arms. I knew something felt wrong. Several residents nodded. Others looked embarrassed. Many of them had believed the story they were told. The mansion lights glowed behind us. Warm. Familiar. Mine. For the first time that night, it actually felt like my home again. The officers spent several minutes documenting the records, photographs, and account logs. Everything was preserved. Everything was recorded. The digital trail was complete. I stood quietly near the fountain while the last of the rain faded into mist. The smell of wet stone filled the air. The younger officer eventually returned my phone. "Keep every backup," he said. "Do not delete anything." "I will not," I replied. Linda finally spoke. Her voice barely carried across the driveway. This was supposed to help the community. Nobody responded. The explanation arrived too late. The records spoke louder than any statement. The meetings, the access logs, the emails, the administrator account, the occupancy records. Together, they painted a picture nobody could ignore. One by one, the guests gathered their belongings. Some apologized quietly as they left. Others simply walked away without speaking. Within an hour, the porch was empty. The driveway was emptying too. Neighbors returned to their homes. The patrol vehicles prepared to leave. Harold shook my hand before heading back across the street. "Glad you came home early," he said. I looked toward the mansion. So was I? The officers departed shortly afterward. Their lights disappeared beyond the entrance gates. The neighborhood became quiet again. Just wind. Just trees. Just home. I walked through the front door and paused inside the foyer. The missing compass sat on the entry table exactly where it belonged. I placed my hand beside it and looked around. The house had been through 2 strange weeks, but it was still standing. And now the records were too. As the system completed one final backup, a confirmation message appeared on the screen.